Gather round, Stoutlaws, I have terrible news. As you may have heard, I was ratioed badly in my last video. It's become difficult for me now to enter online discourse, as it all serves as a reminder of the trauma that I suffered. I've been playing it back over and over in my head, seeing if there's anything I could have done differently to prevent this from happening. Ultimately, what I've determined is that this is your fault. How can you call yourself a Stoutlaw and let this happen, right here in our own backyard? If this happened on some other platform, I'd be more understanding, but no, I was ratioed in my own comment section. So as punishment, you'll be receiving further re-education regarding the dragging exploits. I know you're sick of it, I'm sick of it, but I'm out here getting ratioed for telling you the sky is blue. My work clearly isn't complete yet. First of all, let's take a look at the ratio in question. If you're squeamish, turn away now, as this gets gruesome. As you can see, at the time of writing, this was a brutal 12-0 ratio that I received. Potentially, I could try to evade this ratio by redistributing some of the 100+ video likes to bolster my position in this chain, but at the end of the day, looking at this thread in isolation, we have a decisive ratio, which is unacceptable. The ratioer even had the nerve to mention my health regen debate, which is mental because you may recall that it was a 1v4 debate against top players and a dev, and if he was able to recognise at the time I was right despite looking like a lunatic being the only person making the case, besides Rekrab, who I think chimed in at one point as well, shout out Rekrab, how is it now that being outnumbered proves me wrong? The true reason why there's so many drag zealots out there was pinpointed by another commenter: survivorship bias. The majority of people willing to engage in this topic have developed resilience to dragging from playing Mordhau for so long that they've forgotten that the average player views dragging with complete disdain, hence why a simple to follow argument has escalated into a war zone in my comments. Whilst I'll reference back to some of the comments that were made, somebody actually took up my challenge and released a well-spoken response video which I'll now react to.
Okay, firstly I just want to go over your actual points that you mentioned in the beginning of the video. Number 1, dragging is an exploit. Number 2, it looks janky, and in turn this would get players, turn players away from the game. And 3, it's not good for gameplay. I'll just say like a quick minute about gameplay. I don't know much about gameplay because I'm not an excellent player. I've played probably like 200 hours of Mordhau and I haven't played Chivalry. But I will say personally, I find it kind of fun. And the people that I do play, we are very casual. I don't think the most hours somebody has is probably like 300 at this point or 400. So we're not like excellent players by any means, but we find it enjoyable. At least for me, I find XLs to look a little bit weirder because when I get hit by an XL, not only do I get hit and then I'm like, what the hell just happened? But it doesn't really fit the kind of tutorial. The tutorial tells you like, oh, you know, somebody, or maybe it's not even the tutorial, but they say like, you know, when somebody yells, that's when you know that they've committed to their attack. And XLs generally are so fast that it almost as if like they didn't yell by the time they hit you. With at least drags, I can see that they yell, and I can see that I'm going to get hit by a drag as it happens. And I also think it looks funny, and I kind of enjoy it. But that's all I'm going to say about gameplay.
A lot of people are under the impression that I only complain about things that counter my playstyle when they're clearly new to my channel. One of my first video essays was Mordhau's biggest problem, whereas on my crusade against Insta-XLs during the alpha. Since then, some of those issues have been addressed, and there's less insider type XLs, but the overall problem of unreadability of XLs remains, primarily with the riposte. But the reason they're unreadable is because there's always the threat of the riposte drag. These are two sides of the same coin.
First thing I didn't really think was that strong in your video is that you mentioned this quote, and I think you took it from Wikipedia. I think it's the same quote. In video games, an exploit is the use of a bug or glitches, game system, rates, hitboxes, speed, or level design, etc. by a player to their advantage in a manner not intended by the game's designers, and then you stopped there. The full quote includes this afterthought where it says, however, the precise determination of what is or is not considered an exploit can be controversial, which, based on your previous video, I think you've come to realize. And I think that this controversy comes for a few reasons that you fail to mention. Number 1, I'll talk about intention on the game designers. I think that's kind of a vague statement. You could create a game and your intention is just create a game that offers options to the player. And then what comes out of those options may not be quote unquote intended by you or foreseen by you, but could not be considered an exploit. The example I want to use here is like immersive sims. So a game like Prey, right? Like there's a bunch of options you can do. You can create different builds or what have you. And as a result, you know, certain solutions to problems maintained within the game might not have been intended by the game designers explicitly, but because they gave you this game that allows, you know, the freedom of expression, allows you to do what you want with the mechanics that are within it, while it's not explicitly intended, it could quote unquote be kind of intentional. Like the unintended nature of a game can be intentional. So I'm not saying that this is what the Mordhau developers suggest. They haven't said it, but You could see it that way.
Regarding intention, this has been a sticking point for a few people as they can't understand why I'm so willing to die on the hill of defining drags as an exploit. My willingness to do so is because the term exploit is a pejorative. The negative connotation arises due to its association of janky mechanics. The reason why exploits are often janky is because they are unintended, which means they go against standard logic, and dragging here is no exception. If anything, dragging could win an award for the most janky of all adopted exploits.
Where, like you say later on, like, you know, it's a game of swing manipulation and timed blocks. Maybe they wanted kind of a sandbox version of this that allows for stuff like dragging to exist, potentially. This is just a way for, because you mentioned later that it couldn't have been intended by the game designers because they never mention it in any of the pre-release footage. But if their intention was to make a game that allowed players to express themselves and attack players in these weird kind of ways, and they didn't really know what would come about of doing so, dragging could have been intended, just not explicitly referenced, which, I don't know. If people didn't give it a name, you wouldn't know what to call it, I guess, right? I mean, come on.
Here, you're conflating the Chivalry devs with the Mordhau devs. In Chivalry, dragging was 100% unintended. For proof, watch my first video, Melee's Dirty Secret. But let's say I momentarily concede that dragging isn't an exploit in Mordhau. My silver bullet question that I asked last video, which you didn't approach in this response, still holds up with some minor rewording. If dragging is a good mechanic, why did Triternian not showcase it in the combat dev blog? By asking this, we have checkmate in 3 moves. We all know the honest answer. It would detract from sales because of dragging is ugly. You could answer dishonestly, like the guy that ratioed me. He insinuated the glaring omission of dragging was by pure chance, despite it being the most dominant mechanic of the game. At this stage, he's now discredited anything he's typed in this debate. To those that bite the bullet and admit that dragging pushes players away, my next question is, if dragging is so ugly that it detracts from sales, why not remove the mechanic? Now, you can either wake up from your trance and say, wow, now you mention it, Stouty, you're right, dragging has got to go or our genre is doomed to irrelevancy, and you join the ranks of the unindoctrinated. The other honest answer that you can make is that you don't care it looks bad and you just have fun with dragging, even if it means the genre will never be popular. I've already admitted in my last video I can't argue with this. Congratulations, you've already got the game of your dreams. Go take the short bus down to PH Dojo and drag your fellow jeweler boys until Sandwich and Mystic eventually pull the plug on the server. The concession you make is forfeiting your seat at the table where the rest of us are trying to figure out how to save the genre.
Also, a quote that you got for the definition of an video game exploit was taken from a book from 2003. I don't know how much you think has changed in game design from 2003 to now, but I imagine quite a lot has changed. So using a definition of a video game exploit from something so old, I think is a little bit misleading. I think if you asked, different game designers what they would consider an exploit in the game, they'd all give you different answers. So using this one quote as a way to kind of determine that dragging is an exploit, I think is not really giving enough credit to the developers this day.
You've apparently done more research than me on this quote, and it's interesting to hear that it's from 2003, but it's a comprehensive definition that accurately summarizes exploits as an unintentional mechanic. If you think there's a better definition that we could potentially agree on, you should have given one here, given that the current one holds up surprisingly well.
Now, I can't really talk much about this fact, but it kind of irked me when you said that Mordhau and Chivalry are both a game of swing manipulation and timed blocks, and you used the analogy that they're basically 2 chess simulators, which I found kind of crazy.
My chess example was to prove the point that game design is separate to products.
In my opinion, because I know you don't care about fighting games, but fighting games are essentially games revolving around striking, blocking, and grabbing. It's just a rock, paper, scissors where blocking beats strikes, grabbing beats blocking, and striking beats grabbing. And then each fighting game kind of adds its own spice to the mix. But that's sort of what makes a genre, is that these commonalities within the games, and then, their differences are what makes each game individual. I think in a case like Mordhau and Chivalry, they may have been made too close together in the timeline, so there is a huge overlap, and I think there is, potential where the same player base kind of just transferred over, and, some of the players that like Chivalry made Mordhau and such, so there might be a lot more similarities, but I think considering them 2 chess clones, I think is a little bit strict. I don't know. For me, that sounds kind of crazy.
To bring this back to the topic at hand, tell me how dragging has been made better from Chivalry going into Mordhau. This would strengthen the argument that the former exploit of dragging has been legitimized. In reality, dragging is more powerful than ever and looks just as bad, besides backswinging, which was largely eradicated.
It's similar, at least in my opinion, to suggesting that Valorant and Counter-Strike are both games of angles and peeking. I don't think anybody would consider Valorant and Counter-Strike to be fitting to the same type of player. I think there's, Counter-Strike Go appeals to a certain type of player. Valorant appeals to a certain type of player. Yes, they both like FPS games, but there's a lot to take between each games that make them very different, despite the fact that their base mechanics, if you got rid of kind of like the characters and stuff, would be very...
There's tremendous overlap between these two games to the point where professional players have each repeatedly swapped between each title.
You didn't talk about exploits. I don't remember exactly the context of this argument, but you were like, oh, wave dashing, I don't care about fighting games, they're dead genre. I think that, first of all, I think the idea of a dead genre or a dead game is kind of, doesn't really mean much.
I specifically said in my last video, dead in comparison to the behemoth that is FPS. I've already gone on record before saying I expect the first-person melee genre to one day dethrone FPS, and so I'm not satisfied with anything else besides that rank 1 spot.
I don't know what you mean by this. You said like 2,000 concurrent players is not enough, but I think the concurrent players of a game is dependent on the genre itself and the type of game. For example, if you look at an MMO with 2,000 concurrent players across 20 of its servers or whatever is not going to function, because in MMO, you need auction houses. You know, maybe it's World of Warcraft, you need 40-man raids. If there's 100 people on a server, that's 2 40-man raids and then 20 people that don't get to raid each week, right? What constitutes dead is very dependent on the game itself. So 2,000 players on a fighting game might be more than enough for the majority of regions to get, and with sufficient netcode, might be more than enough for specific regions to find games within 30 seconds and play people of like-minded skill or of equal skill or similar skill or what have you. That might be more than enough. In Mordhau, it might not be enough. I don't know what is enough. In Warzone, you need at least 100 players, right? There's 100 players or 150 players in a game of Warzone, so you probably need more players concurrently playing. So calling it dead, I think, is not fair at all. Also, fighting games are not, I don't even know why you would consider them dead. Fighting game tournaments get a lot of viewers. There are a lot of commentators that make money from fighting games and make enough to supply, maybe they don't, not full time, but they make enough money. Or there are a lot of pro players get a lot of action or some sponsors, and they do get a lot of viewers. Even casual pro players, which I would use for Ryan F, although he's probably just a pro player. But he's popular and gets good views on YouTube, and maybe not, Mango level or viewer numbers like the likes of Shroud or Dr. Disrespect or what have you. But that's for a multitude of reasons other than just the game itself.
Comparatively, fighting games are dead compared to FPS games. Mentioning how fighting game players have to make content to remain pro actually proves my point here. Most CSGO pros are too lazy to even bother making content, and why bother when you're on some fat 5-figure monthly salary? In comparison, fighting game pros have to stream, make YouTube videos, and coach to stay afloat. Speaking of which, use my referral link below to get $10 credit after your first $10 booking on Metafy.
On top of that, fighting games are inherently niche because they're 1v1 games. So, it's a 1v1 game. I mean, how many people like to watch those games versus somebody that likes to watch Warzone? It's not necessarily that good of a spectator sport. And it's not even that easy to play those games and talk to viewers. Like, fighting games are kind of intensive mentally, so if you want to have an interaction with your streamers and build up an audience, you kind of need to play something like Among Us or something that allows for more communication or something. There's plenty of reasons why fighting games don't get Twitch viewers. On top of that, you say, I'm trying to quote, hopefully this is quoted properly, you say part of the reason they are dead, which again I don't agree with, is due to all these obtuse mechanics, exploits, tech that act as an entry barrier to new players. This is unfounded. If people can't use the argument that, hey, fighting games are popular on console and we don't see those numbers, and you write that off as convenient for those detractors because, there's some evidence that I can't actually view, fine, but you can't make claims like this without any evidence yourselves. I mean, I could twist this completely around and say that the only reason fighting games even get remotely any viewers is because these obtuse mechanics, exploits, and tech that act as an incentive for new players. Like, that's the only, maybe it could potentially be the only reason why people play.
Your hypothetical counter here goes against the eye test and all common sense. Simplicity is always superior for easing new users into any game or system.
There's just not that many people that want to play for this reason. There's plenty of other reasons why fighting games aren't popular. Number one, there's not a lot of fighting games that have good single-player content. Some fighting games have really bad tutorials, which is not helpful. There's plenty of reasons. Some fighting games have bad netcode, and you have to fight people, in your house for it to be fun. And that's why they're a lot more popular in Asia, where there are arcades and people go over and play games with each other and stuff like that. On top of this, fighting games, majority of them, are 1v1 games, which take a lot of mental fortitude. You need to be a very specific type of person to enjoy the fun in a 1v1 competitive game with low RNG and stuff like that. The amount of people I know that play Dota 2 and Counter-Strike and are completely you know, hooked onto those games entirely because they think that they're so good, but their teammates always let them down. It just doesn't happen in a fighting game. You can't blame. You might be able to blame the character or something, but at the end of the day, the only person you can really blame is yourself in a fighting game, because you're the only person that has any influence over whether or not you win or lose. There's a lot of reasons why fighting games aren't popular, but saying it's because of these obtuse mechanics is, it's not more or less real than suggesting that they're actually not dead and there's just a lot of players on console that we can't account for.
I don't disagree with anything you say here. In fact, I made the same argument in my video Why Mordhau Died. Unlike fighting games, we don't have to limit ourselves to 1v1 matchmaking, which is why I push so strongly for Gold Rush, the 5v5 competitive game mode.
And then when it comes to exploits, you use boosting as an example, and the fact that Valorant removed it, which I don't think is relevant at all, because one of the things you say is, why would you want to boost when you could just add a ladder? There are plenty of reasons, I believe, but one obvious reason would be boosting involves two people. So in a game like Counter-Strike, if you're making a map and you have a particular position that you want to be, that's a powerful position that you want people to be able to use, but you don't want to make it too easy, one way you could do that is by making it a boost. So you have to have two players there in order to accomplish that position, that strong position, have that strong position. And as a result, it's limited in that way. You can't do it in a clutch situation where you're, one-on-one, you can't boost, right? There's plenty of reasons why you'd want to introduce boosting into a map beyond like where ladder couldn't work.
Like I said before, I don't want to get too carried away trying to justify other games' exploits when it's besides the point, but yes, what you said is true, although some boosts the other player can rotate after it's complete. Also, a lot of the boosts are discovered. For these, the mapmaker has no balance intention at all, hence the problematic nature of boosting and exploits in general.
And on top of that, into Valorant, I think the biggest reason why they got rid of boosting is because they gave a lot of characters options that act as boosts, essentially. So Jett has like the flying move where she can like boost jump in the air or something like that, right? They didn't want to offer a generic option for boosting because then it would kind of minimize the power level of the characters that have boosts. Like there's like that Mei knockoff that has like a wall that she can use to boost teammates. Like you can literally boost in that game. It's just not with standing on top of someone's head. So boosting exists. They just made it more official in order to give their characters more life.
You made my argument for me here perfectly. They removed the exploit of boosting, which is jumping on characters, and replaced them with legitimate mechanics, Jett's flying and Sage's ice wall. This is a textbook example of how a former exploit can be legitimized between two games, something that didn't happen at all with dragging.
It's like, in a similar way, you could consider flashbangs in Counter-Strike to be exploits, because they got rid of flashbangs in Valorant, because flashbangs don't exist, do they? It's the abilities of the characters or whatever. Each one has like a special flashbang. It's like that guy that has like a bird that flashes you or something like that. Or the guy that can do the flick flashbang that goes around corners, like the pop, that sort of stuff. There's plenty of stuff like that in Valorant. It seems this is not a really good argument at all.
I'm not sure why you included this in your video, as there's no stretch of the definition where you could ever call the flashbang in CSGO an exploit.
On top of that, too, you also talk about the Olaf boost and how it was like they were reprimanded after doing so. They were reprimanded for using the Olaf boost because it was a pixel walk. And pixel walks are explicitly mentioned in the Valve rules as not being allowed. It wasn't because they were boosting. It was because they used a pixel walk to achieve the boost. So that doesn't make any sense, in my opinion.
I do watch by the numbers, and I am aware that this boost in particular was a restricted breed of boost, but nevertheless, we can quickly see the confusion that sets in when certain exploits are accepted into ordinary play, when really they're probably best removed entirely, as you eloquently described yourself with Valorant.
And then you claim realism. I'll keep this short because this is already going too long. But realism is a fickle thing in video games. Something that might seem as unrealistic in a video game can actually act more realistically than if it was done a separate way, and that's kind of complicated, but I'll explain how in Tarkov. In Tarkov, for example, you don't get team indicators because they want it to be realistic. You don't get team indicators in real life. You can't see a blue triangle on someone's head. But in real life, there are a lot of things that let you know if somebody is who you think they are. The way they walk, their hair, could be if you're close enough, their smell, their face, their uniform. There's plenty of things you can look at when you look at somebody to see if they're like your brother or your sister or something like that, right? Even gender, for God's sakes. You can't be a woman in Tarkov. So people have argued that they should add team indicators in Tarkov because you don't have these options to like look a certain way or wear a uniform or something like that. You need some way to emulate these other characteristics that you can look at in real life to determine if someone is who they are. So in a way, team indicators in Tarkov could arguably be more realistic than not having them. Because in the meantime, what people do is they like wiggle their gun in the air or look at the ground or something like that, Right? Like, hey, wiggle, tilt your head, like lean back and forth if it's you, which is unrealistic, even though it only come about by some force to be realistic, right? With the lack of indicators. So
none of this related to dragging, as you failed to put it back on topic at the end.
This is very short, but this was some of the arguments that I thought was kind of weird. I personally like dragging because I think it's fun. I don't have a good reason why it should get removed or why it should stay. I just find it fun. So, but I thought some of these arguments you made were pretty shallow, in my opinion.
I've already stated that I can't really challenge that I find dragging as fun argument, but then again, I'm rank 1. I can do whatever I damn well please. I can't prove this, but I suspect a lot of the people that supposedly enjoy dragging subconsciously don't like the mechanic. For every drag they land, they get hit by one themselves. What they probably really enjoy is the feeling of progression. Learning to drag is part of that process in Mordhau. I think they could get equal, if not greater pleasure from learning to read and punish feints. Hopefully, this concludes the discussion on dragging. If you want me to stop talking about it, start agreeing with me, now, and ratio any form of dissent